Hello and welcome to the 14th Annual Iowa Hunger Summit. My name is Madeline Goebel and I am the Director of Community Outreach and oversee the planning and implementation of the summit at the World Food Prize Foundation. As I welcome you to our virtual platform, I am eager to show you around the various features we have compiled to help support a more interactive and collaborative session. Below, you will find a chat feature. Here, you will be able to engage with other participants, react directly to discussions, and prompt further collaboration. It is my hope that we can continue to engage with one another despite our need to be distant. As we continue to look forward to furthering elaboration on the discussions we will have here today, I encourage you to share additional and relevant resources you have found to be effective in your work. Furthermore, some of our panels, both today and throughout the summit, will engage in direct Q&A with participants. Should you have a question for a panel or speaker, please submit your question via the Submit Questions to Speakers button below. We may not be able to get to it live, but we will do our best to follow up. Please note that we do hope to have continual engagement within the chat feature, so we are unable to accept questions via that function. As we continually explore and engage with technology in this new platform, you may find yourself with a few questions. Should you have any tech issues, I encourage you to reference the I'm having tech issues button below, which will connect you with my colleagues who can better support your engagement with the Iowa Hunger Summit. Furthermore, I hope we can all take advantage of the digital platform and engage further and expand conversations and outcomes as we start here today across various platforms. I encourage you to follow our hashtag IAHungerSummit20 on all social media platforms. To better support your direct engagement, I want to draw your attention to the button below the chat function. This will direct you to the hashtag thread on Twitter. As I hope you already know, this year's summit will take place over 3 days, with morning plenary sessions beginning today, tomorrow, and Wednesday at 9 a.m. Central. Breakout sessions will take place each afternoon from 2 to 3. Please note that you will receive, at 9 a.m. Central. Breakout sessions will take place each afternoon from 2 a.m. to 3 p.m. If you have registered and received a confirmation email from the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation, that session will take place today at 1 p.m. Please reference your confirmation email for your unique Zoom login. This morning, I am so exhilarated to have Marlisa Gamblin and Donald Wood of the Racial Equity Hunger National Learning Network joining us for our keynote presentation. The time is now, applying racial equity to our work to end hunger. Through a discussion on the need for racial equity in the work of ending hunger and food insecurity, Marlisa and Donald will explore how intent does not equal impact and why this understanding is crucial to ensure racial equity and justice. Directly following at 10:45 a.m. Central, we will have the session Voice Your Choice, where staff from Iowa Valley RC&D and Feed Iowa First will discuss how the Voice Your Choice tool was developed, how it works, the benefits and challenges of using it, and how this approach to food assistance works towards community food sovereignty. This afternoon, we will have 2 interactive breakout sessions, one Economy, Data Demands Action. This session will provide relevant data on racial disparities impacting African American and people of African descent in the Polk County area. The focus will be on using data to identify key areas of impact and create community-based strategies to eliminate or reduce the disparities. Concurrently, we will also have Stress to Success, prenatal strategies to improve child outcomes with Iowa ACEs 360. Here we will discuss the challenges Iowa mothers are experiencing and how to improve health outcomes by focusing on the prenatal period. The intent of our gathering here this week is to highlight a compilation of resources and initiatives that comprehensively support increased food security in our communities. This year, as we look to directly address the urgency of the need for racial equity within our food system and evaluate the effects and long-term outcomes of shocks to the system, it is my hope that you will gain a greater understanding of the challenges and barriers Iowans face and receive tools to implement long-lasting change. Our founder, Norman Borlaug, said, "Food is the moral right of all who are born into this world, and that without food, man can live at most about a few weeks. Without it, all other components of social justice are meaningless. We are all here because the status quo has not and will not achieve the needed accessibility, equity, sustainability, or foundation our communities require to not only survive, but thrive. I encourage you to be vulnerable, to be critical, to reflect, and to discover, because it is vital that we use this time to further not only the conversations we have here today, but the outcomes of our work in the spaces we fill. Now, I would like to introduce the new president of the World Food Prize Foundation, Barbara Stinson.
Thank you, Madeline, and welcome to everyone to the 14th Annual Iowa Hunger Summit. I want to begin today with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you from the World Food Prize Foundation Hall of Laureates in Des Moines, Iowa, here in the United States of America. These are ancestral, unceded lands of the Bakojay or Iowa, the Meskwaki, the Sauk, and the Ho-Chunk peoples. We remember that many different indigenous communities and sovereign nations have lived on these lands, hunted and harvested these fields and forests, and fished the waters of this region. We recognize that we occupy their traditional homeland and that this land was taken by force and stolen through treaties that were not honored. And we respect our obligation to the land, to all the people who care for it and cultivate it. And we renew our obligations to this land and to all people who care for it. Beginning with these words of acknowledgement, we want to work towards more just, fair, and equitable food systems for all that address the historic legacies of oppression, discrimination, and disregard. And we stand as a global community in solidarity with the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Thank you. As Madeline said, my name is Barbara Stinson. I'm the new president of the World Food Prize Foundation, and I'm so pleased to be here. My first Iowa Hunger Summit to launch. I have a background in collaborative problem solving and am so pleased to have joined the foundation in January to build on the legacy established by Dr. Norman Borlaug and Ambassador Kenneth Quinn, and to take forward the mission of building an even stronger, more impactful, and improved support to our community through the Iowa Hunger Summit and all of our programming. The World Food Prize was created the Iowa Hunger Summit in 2006 with former governors Robert D. Ray, Terry E. Branstad, and Tom Vilsack serving as honorary co-chairs. It was a bipartisan effort and a collaborative space built to address hunger issues right here in our own backyard. The first Iowa Hunger Summit took place in 2007, and we were joined there by the new Iowa Governor, Chet Culver. We were honoring the Nobel Peace Prize laureate and our founder, Dr. Norman Borlaug, and it was a special gathering for him, and one that he would be so pleased to see continue as a time-honored tradition. The Iowa Hunger Summit gathers leaders from across Iowa representing community organizations, business, industry, representatives of all types, state and local government, social agencies, churches, all kinds of religious organizations, schools and universities, social agencies of all dimensions, and individuals and groups that are working, participating, leading efforts and projects to confront hunger. We bring together in this gathering each year food security advocates from across the region to try to address the critical issues of our times for the growing population of food insecure that we know are there, especially those disproportionately impacted this year by COVID-19 and the overall really challenging year of 2020. Today, we have over 500 registrants from all over the Midwest. They come from all the sectors that I've mentioned, and Madeline will tell you more about some of our participants. But it's my hope that you have the chance through today to connect more with the issues at hand and the people working so hard in all of these areas in our region. It's not the same as gathering in person. We hope we can all welcome you back together to meet in person next year here in Des Moines. But until then, we hope you have a really gratifying 3 days this week. Now I want to introduce our primary sponsors. Thank you so much to the Iowa Farm Bureau Federation and Farm Bureau Financial Services. You have been tremendous partners offering continued support over all of these years. And strong allies and partners are really needed, not only to confront the issues and make progress on the issues that we're trying to make, but to sponsor and to support a meeting like this each year. So we thank you. I'm going to introduce now Craig Hill. Craig Hill is the president of the Iowa Farm Bureau Federation, and he took that office December of 2011. Before that, he served for almost 11 years as the vice president of the Federation as well, with a long history and background with Warren County Farm Bureau, et cetera. So he has such a history with us and currently serves as the chairman of the Farm Bureau Life Companies, as well as the FBL Financial Group, Inc. So it's my pleasure to introduce a video recording from our sponsor, Craig Hill.
Good day, everyone. The Iowa Farm Bureau is a non-governmental, private, general farm organization led by farmers and serving agriculture for more than 100 years. I am an Iowa corn, soybean, and pork farmer and serve as president of the Iowa Farm Bureau Federation. Farmers are, and always have been, unique in all cultures because of what they do. They find beauty in growing things. America's founding fathers said our vision of America and farming is inseparable, and consequently, America has been tremendously bountiful in our production, and it's precisely true for Iowa. Where on a per square mile basis, we produce more agricultural products than any other state in the nation. Farmers like myself, we cultivate the soil, we plant seeds, we care for our animals, and we are in direct contact with Mother Nature each and every day. Working in connection with Mother Nature on some days when practical, and doing battle with Mother Nature when required. However, so much more needs to be done because we know, as we live in the Borlaug legacy, it is essential that your food security never be threatened, regardless of age, income, zip code, or nationality. Other issues beyond production can place food security in peril, and those concerns need to be addressed and solved. Even in America, where food is abundant, many Iowans are food insecure, particularly in this time of unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm proud to report that our Iowa Farm Bureau members are answering the call for help, both as producers, but also in another way. In all, this past year, the Iowa Farm Bureau has donated $200,000 to the food banks of Iowa, providing more than 1 million meals to Iowans in need. So today, the Hunger Summit provides us the opportunity to assemble, to discuss, share ideas, and focus on a path toward progress where no one feels hunger. All people, all over the world, without exception, want their families to enjoy healthy, nutritious, and abundant food. Many more champions are viewing today's broadcast, many yet to be introduced, who are dedicated to improvement. It is up to us to work together, to be successful, and to do that, we must work together collaboratively. And this is why the Iowa Farm Bureau Federation and Farm Bureau Financial Services are proud to be today's sponsor and have been your sponsor since 2007. All things are built on a foundation of food. Thank you, and keep up the good work.
Again, many thanks for the continued support of our presenting sponsors, Iowa Farm Bureau Federation and Farm Bureau Financial Services. Now I would like to pivot to our first session. The time is now, applying racial equity to our work to end hunger, with Marlisa D. Gamblin and Donald Wood of the Racial Equity National Learning Network.
Thank you, Madeline, for the warm introduction. I just want to say how blessed I am by even being here. The theme for our segment today is "The Time Is Now," applying racial equity in our work to end hunger. My name is Marlisa D. Gamblin, founding co-chair of the Racial Equity and National Hunger Network. I am so thrilled to be with you. I'm also the Senior Policy Advisor for Bread for the World Institute, and I focus on closing the racial and gender hunger divides. As some of you might know, Bread for the World is a national nonprofit that focuses on ending hunger, which a lot of you also have in your hearts to do, and your organizations also work on the same thing. Let me go ahead and pass it to Donald, my other coach here, to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Marlisa, and hello, everyone. Yeah, my name is Donald Wood, and I'm also honored to be one of the co-chairs of the Racial Equity Hunger National Learning Network, but I also serve as Executive Director of Just Communities of Arkansas, and we are a nonprofit agency that focuses on facilitating organizational and community culture change in terms of advancing equity and inclusion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Donald. And you know, a lot of you might have actually already heard about the Racial Equity and Hunger National Learning Network, but if you haven't, I got you covered, okay? We are a new network. We've been in existence for a full year now, so happy birthday, network. I'm so excited. But we are essentially a network full of individuals, organizations, agencies, policymakers who care about one thing and one thing only, that's ending hunger. But the thing is that we recognize to achieve that big goal, that shared goal that we all have, we must discuss race, but that's not it. We must also apply a racial equity lens, not only to certain segments of our work, but to everything, on the personal level, on the institutional level, to everything, okay? A lot of what we do is we help build capacity in anti-hunger organizations like the ones that a lot of you are a part of, but we also share some of those best practices so that we can engage in the work, not only internally, but also externally when it comes to the programs that we design and the policies that we support. So with that said, we have kind of three pillars. One is to learn, right? We wanna learn from each other, but we also wanna learn from other folks who are experts in this work. The other piece is we wanna be able to empower ourselves with the knowledge so that we can grow both internally, but then also help our organizations do the same. And then we also want to identify ways that we can work together and that we can scale things up that tend to be working in terms of best practices. If you want to join our network, which I think many of you are feeling like I should join the network now. I agree with you. Go to racialequityhunger.org. We'd love to have you. And if you just want to learn more or just share with a colleague and say, hey, there's this cool network that's doing this cool stuff, there you go. So any of you who are familiar with my work, you know that I love to just kind of give a roadmap of how we will be spending our time together, just so that there's no, oh, wow, I didn't know we were going to do this. Everyone's on the same page. So first we'll have our first section. We'll be laying the groundwork for why racial equity is important. Then we will be talking about intent versus impact. I know a lot of you have actually probably heard that short phrase before, but Donald will actually be walking us through what that truly means and what that means in terms of how it shows up in our work and how we can actually start to focus on more systemic change. Then what I'm most excited about is what's next for you. These are the tangible takeaways for you, for your organization, for your colleagues. This is stuff that you all can literally take with you today and start implementing. And then we'll wrap up, of course, with some next steps. And we'll share a little bit more about the Racial Equity and Hunger National Learning Network, a little bit more about our work so that you can say, hey, you know what? That sounds like some good education that I want to be a part of. So I'll go ahead and I'll pass it over to Donald for section 1.
Yeah, thanks, Marlisa. So when Marlisa talks about laying the groundwork for racial equity and why it's important, what we're talking about here is really understanding the historical and current importance of racial equity and the reality that racial equity has in our life, not just as institutions, but as individuals. I kind of wanted to give you all a taste of my story and part of my story when it comes to laying the groundwork for how I got involved in racial equity work. We call this tripping over the truth. And there are moments in our lives where we have the opportunity to literally kind of stumble over, trip over the truth and learn about the history and learn about the current reality that is race and racism. And for me, I was a former executive of a healthcare institution, and we were in a pro-development workshop. And I was somebody who was very convinced that the work that I was doing was, in my mind, God's work, and it was actually end of life care. So I was working with what I call hospice, palliative care angels every day, day in and day out, who I thought provided some of the best medical care in the absolute world. But then we participated in this professional development workshop that was done by Duke Divinity School and Duke Medical School. And in that, one of the professors from Duke Divinity School shared this comment. And not only did I trip over a truth, I ran headfirst into it. And as an executive of a nonprofit end of life care organization, I couldn't believe that people, based on strictly the color of their skin, were not only being treated differently or worse, but they were literally not dying well. And if you're somebody who's had a hospice experience, whether good or bad, you know how critically as important it is to someone's life. It's a human right that everyone dies a comfortable, peaceful, dignified death. And so as I took that comment and what I learned later on from that workshop, I started to put myself in the position to trip over more and more truths. And that's kind of what we're going to try to do here for this first segment of the presentation. So we got a question for you all. And please feel free to put that in the question section of your platform. And the question is, what is your definition of racial equity? And we'll give you guys a few seconds to respond. So please, in the question section, respond. What is your definition of racial equity?
I'm excited for this.
Yes, always excited to learn. Okay, we're hearing folks talk about, it's about treating all people of the race of different races the same.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm also seeing is around education.
Yep.
And the fact that education should be equal.
Yeah, seeing that all races, making sure that they're all represented, which we'll talk about, kind of that concept of representation in relationship to equity and inclusion. So, yep. And
there's one on equal outcomes. So people of color should have equal outcomes because there are currently not equal outcomes. And then there's also one that says not everyone starts off at the same playing field.
Right. Yeah, I like that. I see an intentional state of justice and fairness for people of all races. So nice.
Awesome.
What about the next question, Marlisa?
Yeah. So given some of the things that, you submitted in the question box, right, that Donald and I were able to see, just, kind of inclusion, fairness, representation, equal outcomes. There was a comment around, education is equal for all. Another comment around equality. It sounds like a lot of this is around your understanding about what you currently think racial equity is. So given all of the different comments that we talked about, given all the other comments that we did not see in the question box, why is it so important to our work of ending hunger? Again, given your understanding of what we've already talked about, you're thinking racial equity as. And we'll go ahead, give a couple of seconds. Remember, not to put in the chat function, but instead the button that says submit a question so that we can go ahead and see. We want to make sure that we get all of that. Awesome. Just go ahead, wait a little bit. All right. One of the things that I'm seeing is that there are there's someone who lives in an area. I won't say the area, but someone who lives in an area where there are higher rates of hunger for the Latino population there. There's another comment that says something around the fact that yes, that people of color tend to face more barriers, and at their food bank, they're noticing that they actually come more often than white households in their community. Donald, is there anything that you'd like to lift up?
No, I like what I'm seeing in terms of the kind of consistency of folks talking about it. It's important because people experience hunger differently, and a lot of times because of the racial or ethnic communities that they're part of. So that's encouraging, absolutely.
Yeah.
So earlier I said something about, in response to someone's comment about representation and equity, that we would get to that. And that's important because a lot of times in the work that we do in the intersections of racial equity and hunger is that sometimes we may confuse diversity and representation with equity. They aren't mutually exclusive, but they are different. And so when we talk about diversity, we really are talking about representation in terms of racial diversity, that the folks that you all serve, the voices that are part of the conversation about how you serve are represented at the proverbial table. And Winilia Rivera, who is a consultant in this kind of industry, shared this quote one time that I heard, and it was really landed on me in a way that spoke to that difference between diversity and equity. And so I think about a table, and we think about diversity being a representative of the folks that are part of that community at the table. And then you think about equity, though, for me, is the idea that there was never really a reason why those folks weren't invited in the first place to be at that table, that it is their table, that they belong at that table, that they're welcomed at that table, that table is just as much theirs as it is the other folks that are part of that family or system. What about you, Marlisa?
Yeah, I agree with you. You know, in reading this, one of the things that kind of sticks out to me is so many times how people confuse representation with equity. And for me, it's like, yeah, you certainly want a seat at the table, but then when you're at the table, how are you fully actually being respected? How's your voice, your leadership, being heard, and being centered, really? In many ways, this kind of reminds me of, what organizations have typically done in the nonprofit space, which is to think that like the goal is just to bring someone to the table, right? But then the conditions within the larger infrastructure of that particular organization, or even within the interpersonal relationships between coworkers, it's just not cultivated in a way that when I have a seat at the table, I actually feel fully seen, fully heard, fully safe, fully centered.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I kind of shared a little bit about, what racial equity is, just with even, my response to that. And I appreciate the fact that Donald and I had two kind of not conflicting, but we had two complementary understandings of what that quote meant, right? And I hope that encourages you all to see, hey, there's so many different layers that I have yet to actually even start to peel back. And to me, that's exciting. It means that there's a lot of opportunity for growth. And getting back to the first question, I know some of you were like, yeah, racial equity is equality. That was the first thing that we saw. So I wanted to go ahead and actually talk about this, because a lot of times people get the term equity and equality a little confused. So I just want to spend a little bit more time to kind of walk us through that a bit more. So on the top, you'll see equality. And the way that I like to look at it is that I have my grandmother who's differently abled, and she's unable to actually access the bike that she's given, right? We all have equality. That's equal inputs, right? The same bike. That does not take into consideration, in this particular example, ability, body type, circumstance, anything like that, right? My dad, on the other hand, is super tall, and he's gonna have to get a chiropractor because his back is literally hunching over. The bike is too small for his body type, okay? Me, I am just chilling in the wind. My hair is blowing. The bike conforms perfectly for my body. And then you have my youngest sister who, Lord knows, she needs a little bit more help because she's just a little shorter than me, and it's just not working for her. So she's not actually even able to enjoy the bike, let alone have her hair blow into the breeze, right? With this unfortunately, what we're seeing is that with equal inputs that do not consider circumstance, that do not consider barriers, that do not consider just kind of how things currently are, right? What it does is it actually results in unequal outcomes, right? In this case, the outcome is being able to optimally ride your bike. And unfortunately, my grandmother's not able to even get on the bike. My father is not being able to optimally ride his bike. My sister's not being able to optimally ride her bike, let alone get on it, really. She's not able to even sit, y'all. This is an issue, okay? With equity, what it does is it says, hey, I understand that everyone's different. Let's go ahead and focus on equal outcomes. And then from there, we can work backwards to see what does everyone need, right? Based on a variety of circumstances. Within this example, of course, we're talking about body type, height, and ability. And within that, we see that, hey, my grandmother has a bike that works for her differently abled body. And that's great. Because now, guess what? She's able to optimally ride her bike. The same with my dad. He has a slightly larger bike. And guess what? That's good because he's no longer going to have to pay extra for chiropractic, surgery or anything like that, because he's actually able to ride it in a way that conforms to his taller body. Same with me. If I'm able to still have a really good time on my bike, and now my sister has a smaller bike that meets her circumstances. With this, the beautiful thing is we're all able to achieve the same outcome, which is, dun, 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 I said it 2 times. Okay, all right. It is optimally being able to ride your bike, okay? So some of you might be like, all right, well, that makes a lot of sense, but then what does that mean in terms of racial equity? And don't worry, I got you covered. In the same way, when we're thinking about racial equity, we really need to be intentional about making sure that every community of color has their bike per se, right? Not every community of color is going to be the same, right? And that's something that we have to affirm and that we have to embrace. You might be asking, well, what kind of bike? What are the inputs that determine what kind of bike everyone needs? And there are 3 that I want to offer you. One is historical trauma. Historical trauma is essentially racial trauma that has happened for centuries, okay? And when we're thinking about the context of some of the stuff that we care about in terms of ending hunger, focusing on nutrition, I'm sure a lot of you are actually familiar with WIC, because it's a lot of the clients that we serve, maybe even some of the programs that you have within your own office might be through WIC, and you might be focusing on breastfeeding. And an example of historical trauma is looking at breastfeeding rates. And we know that among African American and Indigenous women, that the breastfeeding rates are the lowest among all racial and ethnic groups. So you might ask why, right? And a lot of the times what we have the inclination to do is only look at like the last 10 years, last 15 years, maybe last 50 years, if that. But we don't take a consideration of, it couldn't have always been like this. What is the origin of the change? So it's important to do that. And that's when we get at looking at centuries, right? So for African Americans, for example, when we were on the continent, we were really intentional about breastfeeding, and that was a sign of forced foods. And that's the same thing with Indigenous populations before colonializers came into what's now known as the US. They were serious about first foods. That was a traditional practice. So you see that with that there were things that actually disrupted it. So with the transatlantic slave trade, that's one thing that definitely disrupted it. But in terms of the chattel slavery within the context of the US, African American women were actually forced to breastfeed their master's children and not be able to breastfeed our own. So that happened over the course of hundreds of years. And then once slavery ended, then we're seeing that we're still kind of forced in domestic roles, right? That are, again, pulling us away from our own children and not giving us the privilege and the time and protection to actually engage in that traditional practice, right? So we need to look at historical trauma. It's so critically important to how, not only what the bike looks like, but how that person receives the bike, the approach. The second thing is the 4 forms of racism, which I will not go into because we have that's a lot. That's a long conversation, y'all. But just know that on the systemic level, right, you have structural and institutional that are important. And then on the individual level, you have personal, right? But you also have interpersonal that are important. How are the different communities of color experiencing the 4 different types of racism simultaneously, but how are they experiencing it all differently, right? Because again, we're not monolith, right? Indigenous populations are going to experience racism in a different way than Black populations are going to experience racism, than Southeast Asian Pacific Islanders are going to be experiencing racism. So really getting at that. And then last but not least, the barriers that disproportionately hurt people of color by race and ethnicity. So essentially, once you get through the centuries, and then once you see what's happening now in terms of how racism is impacting us, and then see what the barriers are, then that will help determine what the bike should be. And let me just go ahead and say this one last thing. I don't want us to get confused into thinking that every community of color, that all Latinos are going to have the same bike, right? So I would say the way that I like to look at it is it should be multi-phase, right? Right now, we have the same bike for everyone, regardless of race, right? So we need to get to the phase of actually being able to look at the historical trauma based on race, based on ethnicity, for each community of color, based on race, based on ethnicity, right? But then we need to take the additional step after that's done to say, okay, well, Indigenous populations in the Northeast are very different than Indigenous populations in the Southwest, and they have different historical traumas, even though they're very much so similar trends, right? We need to localize it, right? Because Indigenous populations in the Northwest are probably going to be receiving a different bike than Indigenous populations in the Southeast, or something like that, you know? So again, try to localize it as much as possible, because guess what? Not every community is the same. So you may have seen this. I put this together a couple years ago. It essentially just shows food insecurity over the last 10 years. And I think that that's important. You know, a lot of the times people are like, oh, like where did these racial hunger divides kind of come from? And, you know, as a researcher, I think it's critically important to see, okay, well, if we have a methodology that says or suggests at least, okay, well, technically, you know, hunger rates are going to, you know, naturally like increase, you know, during crisis and so on and so forth. And that's where we see kind of the racial wealth, hunger divides. That kind of suggests that in economically good times that we don't actually see the racial hunger divide. So in teasing that out, I think what we see is before the Great Recession in 2007, that there were actually racial hunger divides, and Indigenous populations and African Americans experienced hunger at about 3 to 4 times as much as their white counterparts. And the reason why I just want to go ahead and share that it's very similar in terms of the trend line is because African American and Indigenous populations actually share very similar historical traumas. Not the same, but very similar. And when you look in the context of the US, they share the longest histories of historical trauma. So it would make sense then that because those historical traumas are unresolved, that they are experiencing higher rates of the worst things. In this case, we're talking about hunger. So, you know, with this, and actually let me go back. In 2014, this was the peak of the Great Recession. We actually see that obviously it's going to increase, right? And the way that I like to look at it is America is a big family. And anyone who is a part of a family knows that if you have unresolved issues, it's just going to amplify during crisis. And this is how I like to look at it for the US. It's amplifying during a crisis. It's amplifying during the heat of the Great Recession, right? It wasn't that racial divides weren't there. It's just that they actually widened during the peak of the Great Recession, whereby you see that African American and Indigenous populations actually increase at a higher rate than the hunger rates for the blue line, which is essentially what we're seeing for the white population, right? Again, anything that's unresolved will blow up, right, during a peak, and that's what we're seeing. So what does this show? Because there was a racial divide before the Great Recession, and it has only grown it only grew like with the Great Recession. It shows that race mattered before and that race matters now, right? It matters now. And my guess is that with COVID, we're actually going to see a very similar trend line, right? Before COVID, we knew that African-American and Indigenous populations experienced hunger at about 2 to 3 times the rate of their white counterparts. That is going to increase because guess what? We didn't do our due diligence as a country and actually apply a racial equity lens. So let's go ahead and take maybe 1 or 2 responses. Go ahead and click in the question box. Is it possible to end hunger without addressing structural racism or structural discrimination, rather, which you can think of also as structural racism based on race? Why or why not? Few seconds. Okay, I'm getting no because there were racial divides even before the Great Recession. I'm getting yes, if everyone is accepted, that no one should hate one another. Okay, I'm getting that one. All right. Okay, so we had 2 responses. Let's just go ahead and go on because I want to be respectful of time. Let's have a follow-up question to that. Okay, what does this tell us about the importance of not only centering race in your work, but considering race, but also centering it too? And remember to go ahead and just click that, the question button. Okay. All right, I'm seeing one that says, we don't like to center race. It's only considered because there are other forms of discrimination. Okay. All right. I think that's actually really good. So let me just actually just respond to that. So to the first question of, is it possible to end hunger without addressing structural discrimination? And the first person said no. And I just want to affirm that it's not. And yes, there are other forms, of discrimination, but when you're thinking about it in terms of what's the most prevalent form, that is racism, right? When you slice and dice the number for hunger among returning citizens, and these are people who are returning from jail or from incarceration, when you slice and dice the number among, let's say, female-headed households, right? A lot of folks are like, yeah, female-headed households, they experience hunger, at a higher rate than general households, but we see that actually among Indigenous, Native Hawaiian, Latino, and African-American female-headed households, that they're all upwards of 32%, when the national rate before COVID was around 11%. So you're really seeing that racial divide there. Even, among, let's say, women, for example, it's not shared among all women. It's higher among women of color because you have that race factor. The same with children. It's going to be the same divides. We have to, so that's one of the reasons. So, and then when you also make race the center, which kind of gets at this, then you naturally have to talk about the other kind of isms, right? You have to talk about classism, right? You have to talk about sexism. There are other points of intersectionality that you would have to talk about because guess what? People of color experience all of that. But what I like to say is it's often easier to kind of dismiss what is the hardest to talk about, but it's the hardest to talk about that is what's going to get us to our goal of ending hunger. Donald, what are you thinking about, especially as a white male, when you read this, what would you say? What is the importance of not only considering race, but also centering it?
Yeah, as I read this question and then read some of the responses, it makes me think about the Black Lives Matter movement. And this has been a very controversial phrase, especially among a lot of the white people that we work with in our programming at JCA. And this idea of racial equity focusing on justice versus fairness. And when I think fairness, I think, an unbiased way that you treat people, whereas justice is giving people what they're due. And that's essentially what equity is. And if we think about the truth, and you've laid it out brilliantly, I mean, we could unpack those previous slides for hours or days. But if we think about the historical and the current reality and the truth, that again, you laid out brilliantly, but there's so much more information, research, true facts and data that clearly lay out how, especially Black Americans, experience hunger. It's just different. And so, I like to include this slide on here to kind of put that into perspective, is that although we may say things, we may write things in terms of providing equity for all, that's not what our reality is. And so we have to be more intentional about centering Black lives in almost every social issue that we're facing, but particularly hunger.
Yeah. And then what I think about also too is the centering of race too. So it's like, this is one of the reasons why it's important to center race. And then within the conversation of centering race, to also center Blackness, right? And that's another conversation. So some of you, I think, have a solid understanding of, why it is that we really have to focus on race. It's not an opt-in thing. We all need to do it, right? It's all of our responsibilities. In one of my reports that, you'll be receiving in your daily digest, so don't worry, you'll have it. I went ahead and I designed, what was just kind of in my head about, all right, from the time I wake up to the time I go to bed, as a person of color, as a Black woman in particular, I experience structural racism, and so do my brothers and sisters, right? And, but how do I put that in something that, people can actually get, right, and see? So the way that I like to look at it is, you have structural racism, you have racism that exists within every single institution that is connected to our being, right, to our life. And these are certainly not all of them, but they are, I think it's a good representation where you see structural racism actually showing up in housing policies that created racialized areas of concentrated poverty. And that results in a lot of the things that we can see with our eyes, right? We see food apartheids, right? Areas that do not have grocery stores, areas that do not have healthy, affordable, nutritious access to food, and so on and so forth. We see transit apartheids, right? The same thing, but just without transit. We see that as a result of all of this, that wealth was taken out of community. And as a result, we have lower tax bases, which actually result in the underfunding of parks, of schools, of other public entities that, again, touch our life on an everyday basis. We have higher exposure to predatory lending, which again, touches our life on an everyday basis. We see environmental racism where there's higher levels of toxins, higher levels of pollutants that we breathe in from the air that we go in outside, that we play in outside, from the air that we breathe inside when it comes to how our houses are painted, to even the drinking water that we might drink, or the water that we shower in. All of that stuff, that's an everyday thing of how you see structural racism showing up. And that's just one thing. But you also have the racial wealth divide, right? Policies that created the racial wealth divide, institutions that are either the gatekeepers, are essentially the gatekeepers of our financial institutions within the United States. We see that as a result, among households who we care about, right? Households who are experiencing hunger, who are nearing the poverty line, that the racial wealth divide is actually between 3,000 to 0 among white and Black households, all the way to 18,000 and 0. We're essentially white households that are nearing the poverty line, that are benefiting from programs like SNAP and so on and so forth, actually have wealth of anywhere between 3,000 and 18,000. Meanwhile, for Indigenous, Latino, and African-American households, it's 0, with a lot of us actually in debt as a result of the predatory lending piece that I mentioned earlier. So we also have employment discrimination, right? Whereby we are working in the 10 lowest paying jobs. We are disproportionately working in the 10 lowest paying jobs. We are over policed at 10, for Black people in particular, we are 10 times as likely to be incarcerated as whites in about 12 different states across the United States. And of course, we experience structural racism in healthcare, right? The first thing that Donald mentioned in his kind of tripping over the truth was an example of healthcare, right? And just imagine, that was just at the end of life, but imagine that all the way from birth, even before birth, right? All the way, all those different things, we're seeing the manifestations of that, right? All of these things when you go down, guess what? These are barriers that maintain higher food insecurity levels among communities of color. Okay, that's why it's important. And when we're thinking about structural racism, I wanted to offer a definition. And again, it can be a whole dissertation, right? But this is a very quick sentence. It's systemic, right? You see it operates within institutions, but then also between institutions, right? And that's kind of how it is with life, right? You don't just operate in one lane. You're kind of like going in between different institutions, like throughout your day. Structural racism is systemic. It is created and sustained by policies that operate in and across institutions that harm Black, Indigenous, and other people of color while upholding the privilege of white people and reinforcing white supremacy. So really quickly, I wanted to kind of share a little bit about the historical trauma of food insecurity in Black and Indigenous populations, because, you know, that's just critically important. And I want to encourage you all to read the report. Again, it'll be in your daily digest. That also goes under we also share the historical trauma of that as well. But when we're thinking about food insecurity in the Black community, this is something that we need to be very intentional about. This is not something that we really experienced on a wide scale when we were on the continent, right? But this is something, the idea of hunger and severe forms of malnutrition actually started within the context of the US, at least, on the slave plantation, right? Where we were given slops, right? Where we were only given food to have us kind of sustain each other, right? And that was it. Our children were malnutrition. From the example I gave earlier, ourselves, we were malnutrition. You know, we literally got these scraps. And if anyone looks at the context of even Southern food and all that stuff, this is food of resistance, right? This is food that essentially African Americans created, right? Out of needing to sustain ourselves and sustain our diets from the very presence of hunger. Okay, so that's really, really, I think, critical. This lasted from 1616 to 1864. And I say 1864 because technically, although the Emancipation Proclamation kind of, you know, took place, unfortunately, not all people were free. And there's actually research that's coming out in my new report that I'll share a little bit about, saying that there were even families who did not actually realize that they were, quote, free. They were still working in slavery really until around the 1950s, 1960s. So that's also just kind of a reality. We see that under post-emancipation that we really see slavery under another name through sharecropping, where essentially we were indebted to our masters. And again, we see the racial wealth divide that actually initiated during slavery over the last 200 years is now starting to reinforce itself, right? And again, what does that do? Well, if you're in debt, guess what? You're not going to have money for food. So it's an exacerbation of hunger. Obviously, we see that another way that we see this is that we were segregated by race. It was very intentional. We were not allowed to work in other occupations and so on and so forth to the 10 lowest paying jobs. And I'm sure that if we're thinking about our essential workers, you know, and you're going to the grocery store, you're going to get other services and so on and so forth, 9 times out of 10, you're probably going to, you know, see that it's going to be more likely to be a person of color. This all has roots in what we're looking at in terms of the connection between historical trauma and Black communities and looking at the role of slavery and how it still exists. And for Indigenous communities, you know, food insecurity was not necessarily as widespread as it is today before colonializers came and completely stole land and, you know, committed a genocide. When we're thinking about colonialization, it's literally the direct theft of land. So that was land that, you know, your food systems were operating on. That's land that your water systems were operating on. So it limited that. In addition to the forced removal from the lands, right? Indigenous populations were forced to segregate, and they were forced to segregate on in very kind of small plots of land. What did this do? Well, it made it to where it was super remote. And in addition, you know, if you're looking kind of across history and so on and so forth, that actually contributed to higher rates of hunger, being segregated from resources. Like, imagine that. And then also you have broken treaties, and I won't even go into the list of all of them. But the fact is that this actually extracted wealth and resources and created governmental it created it, while at the same time, right, I think the US government acknowledged, okay, well, there's not a lot of wealth and resources that indigenous populations have, so let me create governmental programs to feed them, like FIDIPR, but the fact, or SNAP or whatever. And but the fact is that the government programs didn't actually respond to the creation of what actually created the injustice, right? It was just kind of like, oh, well, we did this, so let's just go ahead and put this kind of Band-Aid on. You know, with indigenous populations, it's important to understand the historical trauma that they've experienced too, that they still experience, because it's so quite closely tied to what we currently see today. So I just want to encourage everyone, do this research, right? Read the papers that I have, but do your own research, because as you are serious about ending hunger, you cannot do so without looking at historical trauma. And if you want to learn more, you can go to the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation. It's an interactive simulation that helps you understand how structural racism was created. You can go to bread.org/simulation. Donald?
Yeah, thank you, Marlisa. And, you know, I just want to say to you and to everyone, you know, in the audience, that this is maybe a good time to just take a deep breath. Because that was a lot of information, but not just a lot of information, but a lot of information that, you know, depending on who you are and where you are in your understanding and journey in racial equity, can have a different impact. It could be triggering for some. It can be difficult, upsetting to say the least for many. It can create this kind of tension or dissonance within us that we aren't used to dealing with, like almost like a discomfort that we're not used to dealing with. And so perhaps you're kind of at the point now where you're like, okay, well, I do understand why racial equity is so important to food hunger, but maybe we kind of were thinking, so what do I do with that now? And how do I kind of process that? So that's kind of what we're going to try to do here in section 2. And we're going to talk about kind of our individual roles in relationship to that, and then what that means to how we got to where we are with our institutions and where we want to be with our institutions in the greater system. So when we think about ourselves, you know, we are as complex an organism, a creation, an invention, whatever you want to call it, as there absolutely is. And our brains are kind of at the center of that. And we take in enormous amounts of information that we are completely unconscious of, in addition to the things we're conscious of every single second. As you see here, 11 million or so approximately per second. And so we are designed and created in such a way that we can process that. And we have developed these shortcuts or mental models or heuristics, as they're called, to be able to process that information quickly and turn that information into behaviors or decisions that at the earliest of time, to keep us alive for survival purposes, but to thrive and to be the successful species that we are, you know, on this planet, and to kind of be the dominant group. But if you could imagine if we weren't able to do that, if we literally had to process everything in what's called in a slow thinking way, is Daniel Kahneman, the behavioral economist and psychologist, wrote in his book Thinking Fast and Slow. We have the fast system, which processes things quickly, the slow system, which enables us to be more discerning and to process. Imagine if we didn't have that slow system. It would be debilitating. We couldn't process. You'd walk in a room, you see a chair, and you have to stop and think, what are all the things that I should do with that object? What are all the things I shouldn't do with that object? What is the other person in this room thinking about what to do with that object? How would that affect me? Imagine that. I mean, you're probably stressed now just thinking about that and the anxiety of it. But that's what is happening in our brains at any given time. So let's kind of talk about what that is. And I know you all have heard this term, implicit biases, but it's very important to at least have what I think is a base understanding of it, if we're going to understand intentionality and impact. Or as Marlisa talked about earlier, intent does not equal impact. Because when we say intent does not equal impact, whether it's individually or institutionally, we have to realize that no matter how good our intentions are, many of times, they land on people or they land on entire communities in ways that is destructive and hurtful. And there's ways that with that mindset that intent does not equal impact, and with the mindset of an understanding of our biases, both conscious and particularly unconscious, we can start to respond differently to those biases and how we behave. So as you can see with implicit biases, we're talking about attitudes or stereotypes that can be good or bad, positive or negative. And the key here that we really want to emphasize at our particularly, that Marlisa and I and the work that we do here is that this does not mean that this aligns necessarily with your beliefs, your values. There's plenty of research to indicate that. And also, it does not reflect your intellect. So again, I want to remind everybody when you're thinking about these, sometimes implicit bias is a trigger word for people, particularly when we're talking about race for white people, because they think about words like white privilege or white fragility, and they want to shut down. But this is no reflection of the person you are or your intellect. This is just a literal scientific, biological, physiological fact of how we are designed and how we behave in the world. And the good news is that despite these unconscious biases that may lead to negative things, we can gradually unlearn. They're malleable. We can replace them and change them. So the next thing we kind of want to think about when we talk about implicit biases are, think to the next slide, if you don't mind. My boss, thank you, ma'am. So I think her unconscious bias was like, I want to hear Donald talk a little bit more about that last slide. So, well, maybe it was conscious. Marlisa wanted me to hear, but thank you for going to the next slide, Marlisa. So if we talk about why does this matter to us, because it's happening with all of us. There is not a human being on the planet who is not impacted or affected by biases, particularly unconscious ones. And it impacts nearly all our decisions, behaviors. These are things that have been conditioned, have been learned. And again, because they are unconscious and they're happening so fast, think about those 11 million pieces of stimuli happening in any given second. Our body's having to react to those. And although not aligned with our values, our beliefs, our intellect, it could, again, it could be hurtful, it could be damaging, it could be destructive. And so we want to develop the ability, or we say capacity. We want to develop the capacity to become more aware and cognizant and recognize those biases. To put this into context, though, for everyone, you may have saw on the slide for section 2, from saviorhood to systems change. And I'll talk a little bit more about saviorhood in a second, but with systems change, that is a mindset and orientation. I like to say it's basically a way of being, of thinking about how we as individuals play a role in the larger system. And that, again, I get that's a nebulous term, but the larger system, we're talking about a system is any sort of collection of interrelated or interconnected parts. Which parts? We're talking actors, as in people or institutions or organizations, but they're interconnected or interrelated in such a way that result in some sort of outcome. And there's some sort of parameter or barrier around them. So a system could be a school, a system could be your workplace, a system could be your family. So when we're talking about systems change, we're talking about 3 things in particularly. The intrapersonal, that's the work that you do. The interpersonal, that's the work that you do with others. And then we talk about the institutional. That's the work that's done within our organizations or within our institutional systems like healthcare, education. So I wanted to show this to kind of give you all kind of a quick mental picture of what we're talking about systems and what that means as far as your interpersonal connection to it. So real quickly, one of the things Marlisa and I wanted to do is really bring it home to some extent about our roles and relationship to structural racism. So you all are going to receive this slide deck as a resource, and we'll be able to dive into these questions more. And for those of you all who have participated in our white supremacy seminar about as far as dismantling white supremacy, you may have seen some of these questions before and used these within your own workplace. But I just wanted to show these to everybody. And again, we're not going to have time to go through them, but I just wanted to make sure that you all kind of had an idea of ways that you can build that capacity by simply asking yourself and reflecting introspectively to these questions. But think about also having these questions amongst people that you feel comfortable with, that you trust, and how powerful and important that can be. So again, this will be a resource, and we encourage you to use these questions introspectively, and also when you start doing more interpersonal work. So how do we move from just good intentions to intentional action that optimizes racial equity? Another way to kind of think about that is, it's not whether the issue is happening. I hope we can all agree and understand that structural racism is happening. And we can also understand that our biases are happening within us and are impacting the way that we decide, the way that we act, the way that we behave. So the issue is, let's start to think about how we recognize when it's happening and responding in a way that is equitable, that is inclusive from a racial standpoint. So what happens when acts of charity overshadow pursuits of justice? Or actually, let me ask a different question. What actually happens when acts of charity combined with an imbalance of institutional power overshadow pursuits of justice? And there's a brilliant James Baldwin quote. We actually have this a poster of this in our office at JCA, because obviously justice is a core part of what we do in our work. And it's very important to understand, no matter how good intentions are, that ignorance or misunderstanding, the lack of understanding the whole truth, especially in racial equity, as Marlisa laid out for us, that combined with power, especially institutional power, can have damaging structural effect. And an example that I want to share with everybody is, if we think about systems thinking, there's a concept of understanding archetypes or understanding mental models. And these archetypes are examples of collective behaviors that have led to some sort of outcome. And we can kind of look at those archetypes and use those as sort of a template or a lens to different systemic efforts. For example, one of the ones that I wanted to point out was fixes that backfire, or some people may know it as kind of the law of unintended consequences. When we approach the work, as let's say, of ending hunger, and from our own good intentions, and without that racial equity lens, without that systems thinking orientation, a lot of times we can focus just on efforts that are just band-aid approaches. And I say that with the best of intent, because those are critically important. There are always issues that need to be addressed absolutely immediately. But a lot of times organizations, because of our good intentions, because we as human beings, like a lot of times instant gratification, or we like to be able to measure things, or maybe we have an industry in the nonprofit world from a foundation standpoint that really rewards immediate results and then we focus on just those kind of quick symptom addressing things, or the Band-Aid type things. And we don't think about, from a system standpoint, maybe the damage that it's doing by, for example, in food aid, a lot of time, putting more and more food out there without addressing the reason why are these people hungry? What can we do to address our resources and redirect our focus and attention? Not redirect, but provide more focus and attention on the why, and why this system is even occurring in the first place. Then that could help us address this issue of hunger. So the next kind of image here is one that I hope that you all, like with the history and the information that Marlisa provided, can spend some time on understanding systems thinking, especially if you just go onto a search engine and type in systems thinking for social change. Trust me, you'll find quite a bit of powerful information in there. And this one in particular, as I said earlier, a lot of times human beings kind of focus on instant gratification, or we kind of have to focus on short-term goals without the idea of focusing on the larger system or goal, because events are so tangible. They're so easy to understand or document, that the tip of the iceberg. But if we look under the water, there's these other three areas of the iceberg. And particularly, I just wanted to underscore the mental models. Those are the archetypes or mental models I talked about. If we really think about how do we end hunger, and how do we end hunger with a racial equity lens, let's look at the assumptions, the beliefs, the values that we have as a hunger fighting system. And if we think about just from your institution, let's really look at that, and how does that relate to what you've now learned and what you're going to continue to learn, that Marlisa shared and taught with you, as far as what racial equity is and how the system works. So as we go into the kind of the final section of our presentation before we get to Q&A, let's talk about what's next. Now, how do we go from transformation, or excuse me, from individual work to that kind of institutional transformational work? The first two sections, we really focused on building that understanding of where we are and where we've been. You know, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and that is critically important. But at this point, in order to create systems change, you have to also understand where you're going. Where do you aspire to be? What's your vision as an individual, but also as an organization? And then when you hold those together, you create that tension between where you are and where you want to be. And that's where change happens. We think about, you know, if everything was just kosher and everyone agreed on everything and everything felt nice at all times, we would never push ourselves to innovate, to change. Movements wouldn't happen without that kind of tension about where we are and where we want to be. So what do we aspire to be as individuals? But where do we also aspire, or what do we aspire to be as institutions? There's two concepts that I just want to lay out there before we turn it back over to Marlisa. And from an individual standpoint, we're talking about humility, or in this case, racial humility. And from an institutional standpoint, responsiveness. So first, let's talk a little bit about racial humility. A couple things I just wanted to point out there with racial humility is how important it is that this is a lifelong commitment. I'm sorry, everybody who wants a turnkey solution, there just is not one. There are numerous strategies, tactics, policies, procedures that can get us towards institutional and systemic equity, but that individual work is so critically important to do day in and day out. That doesn't mean you don't take care of yourself. That doesn't mean that you aren't vulnerable. That's where humility comes from. You aren't vulnerable to realize I can't keep doing this. There's times, and I know Marlisa's felt this too, because we commiserate sometimes because we talk about this stuff every day, when I want to quit. I'm done. But through that self-evaluation and being humble about critiquing myself, but also keeping my vision, my aspiration in mind, you know, I keep, you know, moving forward. But what about responsiveness? So with racial responsiveness, the critical word here is design, intentional design. So when you're talking about responsiveness, you are creating an institutional space where people of different racial and ethnic identities not only feel welcomed and feel like they belong, but you can react to this world that is absolutely unpredictable, and you can respond in a way that continues to create that sense of inclusion and equity with folks from different cultural and racial and ethnic backgrounds. And it's important too, and we could spend again another hours and days talking about intersectionality, but I just wanted to point out another thing that we encourage you all to do more research on, is the idea of intersectionality and how the different cultural dimensions that make us up, our different identities, the way they interact with our race or with our ethnicity creates the uniqueness that we are as human beings. And then so we respond to things differently. And so when you think about intent does not equal impact, you kind of need to think about too the fact that Marlisa is a Black woman. That doesn't mean that every other Black woman is going to have the same reaction to dialogue or to a policy, because there are different dimensions that make up Marlisa, different identities that make up Marlisa. So finally, before we get in kind of the final stretch, the last stretch, is this is what we're talking about when we think about what a racially responsive and one that promotes humility looks like. So I'm just curious, real quick, 15 seconds. Feel free to use the chat if you want to. You can just put in there kind of what sticks out to you in this section. What out of these four kind of really resonate when you read that? You're like, I see whole self. Yes, absolutely. It's so important to think about being able to bring your whole self to work, being able to represent your race. Think about, the politics of hair is so real in this country that we literally have laws on the books in certain states where we have to mandate people to be treated equitably, inclusively, so they can just wear their hair naturally to work. So think about all the folks that can't bring their whole self to work because the way they'll be judged, the way they'll be treated, and they just want to wear their hair away. They want to represent a holiday by something that they're wearing that represents their ethnicity or their race, and they aren't able to do that. So thank you for bringing that up.
Awesome. So maybe we might need another deep breath. Deep breath in, y'all. And deep breath out. Oh my gosh. Thank you, Donald. That was really good. I really appreciate how you started talking about the aspirations, right? And the fact that sometimes our intent about kind of maybe even where we are doesn't necessarily equal kind of where we aspire to be, and how important that conversation is to have with yourself, right? But then also thinking about it on the institutional level. So I'm sure that all of us are actually really aspiring to have programs and policies that are racially equitable so that we can end hunger. And I think probably right about now, you all are probably like, all right, cool. You all shared a lot, but how do I start to do this work in terms of applying a racial equity lens to my own programming, right? Maybe some of you work at food banks. Maybe others of you work at distribution centers. Maybe others of you work with SNAP agencies, with WIC offices, with child nutrition, you name it, the list goes on. But what about policies within my organization? Don't worry about it. I got you covered. So if you go to bread.org/racial equity, you can find all of the tools that I just mentioned. I actually had the pleasure of designing a scorecard to help us, just be able to feel confident about being able to evaluate where a program is versus where we aspire it to be, okay? And honestly, the scorecard is a really good way to help you see kind of how a program or how a policy is promoting racial equity or is not promoting racial equity, where it is, so that we can see, okay, like if it's at a 1, like these are some of the steps that we need to take in order to get it to that 5, right? And I just want to encourage you all that, as Donald was talking about earlier with the intent versus impact, I believe we all have good intentions, but the fact is that good intentions is not going to eradicate racism. So we have to be really intentional about understanding that with the way that things have been, we've had good intent, and unfortunately, with the numbers that we shared earlier, we see with the racial hunger divides that racism is being maintained, right? Racial hunger divides are being maintained. So because of that, we need to actually focus on our impact and reorient our posture in a way that allows ourselves to be humble and accountable to that goal, right, of equal outcomes based on race. So let me just go ahead and explain a little bit of the scorecard. The beautiful thing again is, and I've been presenting it to a ton of folks, this is an easy thing for you all to do. This is something that is very concrete, very tangible. So it goes from 0 through 5. And 0 you can think of as a harmful policy. This is specifically targeting communities of color in a negative way, right? So it would make sense then that it would worsen racial inequities. An example of this that specifically targets communities of color, you can think of as the detention centers, right? That is 100% targeting Black and brown undocumented immigrants, and with a strong emphasis on brown, right? That is something that is worsening racial inequities. It's something that we can definitely kind of with our visible eye without any analysis say, oh, that's bad, right? So that's kind of what we're thinking about with 0, okay? I would actually argue that a lot of our programs within the anti-hunger community actually fall within kind of 1 through 3 with a really strong emphasis on 1 and 2. That's where the majority of our policies, that's where the majority of our programs actually end up lying once you do the analysis behind it. So you might want to ask, okay, well, what is 1? 1 is a broad-based policy that appears to be race neutral. So you might ask what that means. And essentially, it's broad-based for a lot of programs that we care about based on eligibility, right? So if you meet if you're below a certain income threshold, then it's broad based on that, right? All households below the poverty line, for example, right? It appears to be race neutral because there's actually provisions that when you analyze it a little bit more and kind of like look under the hood, you would actually realize that it has negative effects on subgroups within different communities of color at higher rates than it does for our white counterparts. So within that, it's really the provisions that often go underlooked that would actually worsen racial inequities. You might ask what an example of that is, and I'll give you one. So an example of that is my sister. She lives in Nevada. She was telling me how, and she's telling me how how a private tech company partnered with the government, and they were able to provide free internet access, or not free internet, access to the internet for $9.99 a month. And then I was like, oh, that's cool. And she said, okay, this is for lower income families. And I was like, all right, like that's cool. Within that, it's broad-based, right? So then we would think it's probably more of a 2, right? Okay, it's broad-based, like it's focused on class, all right. But there were 2 huge provisions in there that within the context of Nevada actually majorly impacted Black and brown bodies. So one of them was you needed a social security number. And what does that mean? It actually is going to target in the way where it reduces the eligibility, it just eliminates the eligibility for undocumented parents, right? So what does that mean then for their children and for them going to school and so on and so forth and being unable to really access that? That's an example of worsening racial inequities. Another thing is that you had to have good credit. And when you're thinking about it, you're like, all right, like good credit, like, that doesn't mean anything. But when you go down to the historical trauma of, okay, well, where did credit originate? Who had credit? Who doesn't have credit? How does the 4 types of racism impact credit? Who has credit? Who doesn't have credit? What is deemed as bad credit? What are the barriers that disproportionately impact communities of color? Going back to that first slide when I talked about racial equity, right? And trying to figure out, okay, what type of bike do you need, right? Looking at all 3 of those things, then you actually realize that, oh, wait, predatory lending within Nevada is actually in racialized areas of concentrated poverty to specifically target Black and brown communities. So having bad credit is actually you're going to have a higher rate of that among Black and brown communities than you are white communities, simply because you looked at the historical trauma associated with that particular policy. So when it's implemented, what does that do? It actually excludes a lot of Black and brown people that need it. That is what worsens racial inequities, right? With number 2, it's broad-based. So just think of it as, let's say the internet policy that we just talked about, just the internet policy, but it didn't have those provisions. So it's like, okay, all low-income people, regardless of anything, you can just go ahead and receive the service. So that's broad-based. So with some of the broad-based stuff, it might mention the need for targeted support. It might say, oh yeah, communities of color experience higher rates, but then it doesn't actually have a plan to address it, right? So the internet example might say, there are a lot of communities of color that lack internet. We're gonna give low-income families across the state access to internet for $9.99. So what it does is it acknowledges that there are racial divides, but then the solution isn't to address the racial divides within the digital gap, right? What it does is it says there are racial divides, but I'm going to do a class-based policy. I'm not going to do anything that's incorporating racial equity. What this does is it actually just maintains current divides. So the way that I like to look at it is, let's say I'm here, right? And then I have a friend who's here, who's white, right? And we're both experiencing hunger, but we received, let's say, the internet at the same rate. So then guess what? It just raises the floor. So it does nothing about the inequity, right? The racial inequity just remains the same, but it raises the floor. So that's what we need to think about with broad-based policy. With number 3, it's broad-based plan with elements of racial equity. So let's say there's some aspects that actually explicitly promote racial equity, but guess what? The recommendations are simply not based in the racial trauma that we talked about earlier. For number 4, at least half of the policies are based in racial trauma, right? At least half of the policies are targeted in a way where it's racially equitable. And with number 5, the entire policy focuses on people of color put at the center in terms of the co-creation and all of that stuff. And guess what? All of the policies also address and are rooted in historical trauma. So there are, and this is also just in the scorecard that will be sent in the Daily Digest as well, 5 principles that are helpful for us to kind of get to that place. The first principle is to center the needs and leadership of communities of color first. So one of the ways that is before you design a program, before you design it, when it's at the idea, when you're thinking, oh, like we might do a program, right? The idea stage, that's when it's important to center the needs of communities of color, from the inception to the design, to the implementation, to the evaluation. In all stages, we must center the needs of communities of color. Another piece of centering the needs and leadership of communities of color is also centering the research that we bring to the table, right? So what are, and I would say Western and non-Western forms of research, right? Maybe it's oral research, maybe it's lived experience. How are we bringing that to the table and honoring that? That's critically important. And the last thing I want to say is this. Part of this is also decolonializing the way that we've thought about expert. So, for me, as you might know, I have my master's, right? My mom has her GED, and she experienced the intersection of racism, classism, and sexism, right? That makes her an expert in her own right of, how racism is impacting her, right? We should bring her to the table so that she can be respected in that leadership capacity as an expert, as well as me, right? So it should not just be, oh, let's get kind of the creme of the crop, the talented 10, the folks who are acceptable, all that stuff. We really need to kind of think about, okay, what's the historical trauma attached to that, right? Center the needs and the leadership and the expertise of communities of color first, specifically the communities of color within your community who are directly impacted in a way where they have lived experience, okay? The second principle is to name and consider each community of color individually. Stop using terms like minority. So that is problematic for a variety of reasons that I won't go into. But one of the main things that you should really be thinking about is to not monolithicize communities, right? We all have our different historical traumas, as I mentioned earlier. And then the third is to analyze specific outcomes for each racial and ethnic group, which might sound kind of germane, but in many ways, this actually does not happen because we typically don't actually even capture all the data for racial and ethnic groups, right? So it's important to do that, but it's also important to ask, well, why? And when you ask why, then that's how you get at the historical trauma piece. The fourth is to set up the policy or the program response in a way that's actually responsive and proportionate is the biggest word here, proportionate to the historical impact that we talked about. If it's that it's not proportionate, then you're not actually working in a racially equitable way, because guess what? That means that my father, who is super, super tall, right? You could respond, but give him a really small bike. That's not in a proportionate way with what he actually needs. He needs that larger bike, right? Think about it in terms of historical trauma for communities of color. We really need we need the response to be proportionate to the centuries of oppression that we've experienced. And the fifth and final thing is to have a robust implementation and monitoring plan that ensures that the implementation plan is racially equitable. Because a lot of things, you just think about the design, but the implementation needs to be racially equitable. Who's actually implementing? It should be community implementing, right? It should be community designing, right? It should be that co-creation. And oftentimes that's not necessarily the case. So I wanted to go over an example, and I know that we don't have a ton of time, so I won't actually ask folks, but the stimulus checks. This is an example of a broad-based policy where everyone was given $1,200. So the question that I had to you is whether or not it was based on the tenets of racial equity. And you all can put in the chat just so that you all can kind of see. Due to time, I'm not going to be able to respond to that. But, if you think about it, just go ahead for a minute, just, put in what you think it might be like in the chat. Initially, I was thinking, okay, the stimulus package is, $1,200 to everyone, regardless of anything That would be two, right? It raises the floor for everyone. It's broad-based. But then when you look at it a little bit more, then you actually see that the IRS, first of all, required that you filled out taxes, right? So then that automatically means that folks who were, and that it went to a bank or maybe a physical address and so on and so forth. If you filled out taxes, guess what? It's because you make enough income to do that. But if you don't, then you don't fill out taxes. You have to fill out something else, and you have to have the internet for that, and you have to have a computer for that. You can't do it on your phone. All of these things are disproportionately and sometimes majorly actually hurting Black and brown communities, not to mention the fact that a lot of returning citizens with child support arrears were actually excluded from receiving the stimulus checks. And returning citizens who are Black and who are Latino experience food insecurity rates at around 91%. Okay, that's about 7-8 times the amount that you're looking for a general household. So in that, we see that the provisions actually negatively impact subgroups within different communities of color, making the stimulus checks with the design as well as the way it was implemented actually worsen racial inequities. So it's actually a one. It's actually a one, y'all. So I guess really quickly, Donald, what would you say that this, like, how would you say that this relates to our conversation earlier about intent versus impact?
Well, just simply, I think it's that we want to assume good intentions, and I think most folks that are leading this policy, development and policy implementation are good people with the best of intentions. But without that lens, without that racial equity lens, or that systems thinking orientation, they unintentionally don't help or even actually further harm entire groups of people. And that was an absolutely brilliant example.
So now we have the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And I actually do want you all to go ahead and click on the question so that Donald and I can see. This is for households who are living below the poverty line who are eligible to receive nutrition assistance. Just go ahead and say yes or no if it's rooted in, if SNAP is rooted in tenets of racial equity that we talked about. And then tell me on a scale of 0 through 5 where it would go based on what we just talked about. So just go ahead, the question box, just go ahead, click that, put 0 through 5, yes, no. And I'm seeing 3, okay? I'm seeing 3, and then the person who said 3, because it helps, it disproportionately helps African Americans and Latinos, okay? I see another 3, I see a 1, I see a few 2s. Because it's broad-based, it doesn't actually have any bad provisions. SNAP is a good program. Okay, awesome. So thank you for your participation. So I just want to go ahead and note the fact that SNAP actually does, mention a lot of the times, like we mentioned, oh yeah, communities of color have higher levels of hunger, so on and so forth. So in that sense, I could see where some of the folks for 2 are kind of talking about where it mentions the need, but then because it does not do anything in terms of actually addressing the reason, right? The reason for the divides, or it does not do anything to compensate what we're seeing in terms of the divides, we see that it can't be a 3, right? So then that kind of leaves us to whether it's a 1 or a 2. And the question now becomes whether or not there are any hurtful provisions. And I would like to offer that when SNAP was first created, it didn't really have any hurtful provisions. So I would say it would be safely broad-based, right? It would just go ahead and increase the floor. It would really do nothing to kind of focus on like the inequities between communities of color and white households, but it does do something in terms of actually raising the floor from where they both were, right? Unfortunately, there are provisions, one of which is the provision that makes it illegal or ineligible, really, for people with drug conviction felonies from receiving SNAP. And when you're thinking about the historical trauma attached to that, we're really talking about Black men in particular who were being hurt. So because of that, right, and because of what I told you about in terms of among Black returning citizens, the food insecurity rate is actually upwards of 90%, we're seeing that that's probably just going to increase it even more. It's worsening racial inequities. And when we're thinking about the conversation of intent, I think a lot of us have the intent around feeding everyone is important. Okay, that's not a bad thing. That's a good intent. The question now becomes, well, if we're taking into consideration the racial wealth divide, and we know that among all households, African American, that all of them are on SNAP are actually running out of food in the third week, but because of the racial wealth divide actually increasing among SNAP users, that African American households, for example, are actually running out even before that third week. And I think in one of the things that you all sent to us that we read out was that some folks are seeing at their food banks that African American and Latino households are actually coming more often than their white counterparts, and it's precisely because of that. So if we know that, then we need to respond to that, and that would essentially require, and again, I would encourage you to read my report. It would really require an approach that says, okay, because I know that there's that racial inequity, I'm actually going to provide just general support for all households that receive SNAP, but I'm going to also provide additional support that responds to the racial wealth divide that families in that threshold actually experience. So that means that African American, Indigenous, Native Hawaiian, Latino families would receive additional monthly support congruent to the racial wealth divide that they currently experience. Right? That way they don't run out of food quicker than their white counterparts who are benefiting from the same program, right? It's all about equal outcomes. That's what we want. And this is where we can actually have the honest conversation of, this is what our impact will get us. How do we get there, right? Think about this as well, you know, for your own programs and policies in your organization. Think about the intent. Like I said, please read resources, okay? You can go to bread.org/racial equity. You can read the report that I talked to you about for SNAP, WIC, and child nutrition. It helps you understand how to apply racial equity lens to that. Also, I have an upcoming report. I'll be able to send you all the executive summary, but the longer report that actually goes into historical trauma, so on and so forth, I'll make sure to be I'll make sure that you all get it when it comes out, okay? It talks about racially equitable responses to COVID-19 and specifically focuses on food insecurity. All right, Donald.
So we wrap up, everyone. Again, maybe it's time for that third deep breath. So take that deep breath and as many as you need right now, because we understand that this is at best complex, messy work, but it's clearly necessary work. And I hope you can tell just, I think, from the tone of Marlisa's voice and you know, and the inflection in our voices about how passionate we are about this work, that we are not only, you know, supremely intentional about this work, but we are also, you know, supremely humble and realize that we have so much more to learn. And we hope that you all kind of get that sense that there is so much more to learn. But it's not going to happen overnight. But we do hope that you can commit, as you can see there on the last step, is commit to making this a regular part of who you are and the orientation that you take towards addressing hunger. And you can do that by fitting that into your life and your work. You can diversify your media, not just your news sources, but the entertainment that you get. Think about the exposure, just literally the physical exposure you have to different neighborhoods or areas of your community where you can be around people that are different than you, that look different than you, that think different from you. Just exposing yourself is a huge step that you can take in this work. But we also realize there's so much more work to do. So there's all kinds of things you can read. You obviously can join the network, which I'll talk about in a second. Using the scorecard is critically important. The Wealth Gap Learning Simulation also. So these are just, again, I remember I mentioned earlier, there's some strategic, tactical, tangible things you can do. Here they are. But ultimately, you've got to kind of commit yourself by wrestling with, reckoning with that tension between where you are and where you want to be as a racial equity ally, champion, advocate, co-conspirator, accomplice, whatever word you want to do. The point is that you're fighting for racial equity, where you want to be and where you are. So the final thing that we'll say before we open it up to, I think, questions and answers are take care of yourself and know that you're not alone in this work. You've got hundreds, if not thousands of people that are in this. You've definitely got Marlisa and myself. You've got also the Racial Equity Hunger website. at racialequityhunger.org. There you will find our podcast series that was the brainchild of Marlisa, and it was turned out to be one of the most informative experiences I've ever had in my life in such a short period of time. I think there's 6 or 7 episodes where we spend time with the African American, Black community, the Indigenous community, the Latina communities, learning about the relationship with hunger and COVID-19 with some of the most brilliant, committed minds in the entire planet. And then also our Dismantling White Supremacy Challenge. Check that out too on our website. That's part of our 4-part webinar series where you can go back and listen, learn more from Marlisa, because that's what we all need to do and want to do.
Or Donald, we're all featured.
A little bit. But, we're thankful for everyone's time, your participation in this process. We appreciate you taking this seriously and moving forward with this process. Any final thoughts, words, Marlisa?
Join our network
and
ask some questions. I know we're running a little on time, so maybe we can go ahead and answer questions in the chat at the same time that we can answer questions verbally. So maybe you can take the first question if you want. I think I see some questions. You can kind of scroll through, see which ones you want to take, and then I can go ahead and take one as well, and then we can go ahead and wrap up.
All right, sounds good.
Remember to go ahead and hit submit on the questions, the question box. Okay, y'all?
So I see here, and I'll definitely field this one. As a white person, how do I even begin to have a meaningful conversation about race or racism? Let alone, this isn't part of the question, but it may be thinking, let alone things like white supremacy or white privilege or white, fragility. I would say the very first thing you can do as a white person is focus on building your capacity to not necessarily start the conversations yet. That's something we can definitely talk about at some point. But to be able to stay in those conversations, it's kind of like your racially equitable muscle or stamina that you need to build. And you do that by listening and consciously listening, which is different than active listening, where you repeat back, what someone says to clarify. Conscious listening is where you literally get yourself in the mindset where you drop everything, all your distractions, and you intentionally reach out to people that are different than you. In this case, in this context, people of a different race. And if you're white, people that are Black, Indigenous, Latina, other people of color. And you listen to their lived experiences. You listen. When I say, again, consciously listening, you are not stepping up and thinking as a white savior you want to solve the problems, or you're not focusing on your own emotions and getting upset and breaking down and thinking, oh, I can't handle this, and taking away from them and them sharing their stories. You are building that capacity to stay in those kind of conversations and consciously listen. And not only does that benefit you, but it also becomes a benefit to the other person to be able to have someone that they trust and can share their whole self, their experience with. So I would strongly encourage you to reach out in earnest to people that are different than you, particularly people of different races, and just talk to them about who they are, their experiences. Use some of those questions that we're going to provide you in this slide deck, but listen. What about you, Marlisa? What are you seeing?
I'm seeing a few, and I try to answer some in the comments and stuff. But I think the one that I kind of actually wanted to pick up was, let me find it again. So thank you for sharing and spending your time. You're welcome. We're honored to be here. I work at a predominantly white organization, and we would like to use the scorecard, but we're mindful that the first principle focuses on centering communities of color. How do we do that? I think that's a really thoughtful question. I just want to say thank you for that. As I've been going virtually across the country, sharing this tool, that's actually come up more times than you know. So you are in like company, okay? I think at the mega level, what this speaks to is the fact that we really need to kind of focus on hiring practices within your organization, right? And not just, oh, we want to diversify, but really kind of looking at going back to the thing that I offered about decolonializing what we think about when we say expert, right? Are you requiring a college degree? Does it, ask yourself why? Why do we feel compelled to do that? Are we valuing lived experience of racism at the intersection of hunger? And acknowledging that lived experience is probably the best form of racism. Something that I let folks know all the time is, yeah, I graduated from an Ivy League, true, but my graduation from an Ivy League did not teach me half the stuff that I'm using. Literally, it's lived experience. If I would have to do a ratio, I would say it's 70% lived experience, 30% what I learned in school, period. And that's the honest truth. So, think through what your qualifications are, right? And then I think it's also important to identify people in community and just ask, hey, what are the things that you feel like you would need, to feel safe and feel heard in an environment like this? I don't think we've ever really done that. Our organizations don't really open ourselves up to that scrutiny, but I think it's important to look at the people who you want to be there, and just ask, and then you all can even co-create a process, not necessarily an outreach process, but maybe kind of like a trust process too, because presumably speaking, you may not have a trusting relationship, with communities of color at this point, right? So even building that relational piece, I think, is so critically important. And then obviously just transforming the way that you're thinking about your hiring process, what your qualifications are, why they are that, how they connect to historical trauma, even where your hiring processes lie in terms of the 0 through 5, right? Scorecard that we just talked about. Are they being co-created with people of color, right? Are they rooted in historical trauma? All of these different things. And also making sure that once you do transform that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are not segregated into the lowest paying jobs and the admin stuff, kind of throughout. So that's one piece. But I would say that needs to, you all need to have that conversation and start getting the ball moving when it comes to that. I think while you are doing that, what I recommend is actually speaking with people in the community and say, hey, and be humble. Donald mentioned the need to be vulnerable. Be vulnerable. Say, we have not gotten it right. We've had good intentions, but we've realized that our intentions and our impacts are not aligned. We're going through a transition, and we are trying to look inwardly, and we're trying to be honest, and we're realizing that we didn't actually get it right. Can we come together, right? Can you do us the honor of spending time with us? Can we also spend time with you? Can we walk together to develop ways to improve it? We want to be in a posture of listening. We want to be in a posture of walking in solidarity. We realize that we haven't actually been in a posture of listening and solidarity. We've been in a posture of saviorhood, but we want to change towards systems change. So can we start that? Can we start that conversation, right? And what I would say is maybe it's ask them kind of what works for them, right? In terms of their emotional capacity and all that stuff, but also they need to be paid. So in my research, I practice what I preach. I've actually made sure to pay all of the Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who I work with, and especially those who are currently living near or below the poverty line. I think that's critically important. And also ask them how they would like to be paid. Maybe maybe a check is not the best form. Maybe they want a Target gift card. Maybe they want cash. Even things like that. That's important. And I think in addition, to folks with lived experience, who are some of the community leaders who have been doing research, who do have anecdotal data, all those people, right? And going to maybe even the institutions of trust, right? The institutions within the community that have a good pulse on who you should be talking to, because presumably you probably don't know that list, right? Have them lead, respect their power, respect their leadership, and pay them for their expertise, because without it, your organization can't change. So again, longer term and what you should be focusing on parallel is definitely systems change in terms of hiring practices. And for the short term, thinking about like building relationships with local community and making sure that it's kind of in the form of like advisors that get paid, so on and so forth. But that should not be where you end up. This is while you are simultaneously working on changing the hiring process, okay? But ideally, your goal is to make sure that the community with the need, in this case, experiencing hunger, who are people of color, that those are the people who should be staffed in your organization. Because then you wouldn't have to do that outreach, right? Because it would already be a racially equitable kind of situation where, you know, their voices are being brought to the table, that's being centered, and all of that other stuff. So I just want to go ahead and I guess share that. Do you have any last words, Donald?
Nothing that I can add to that. No, ma'am.
So we just want to thank you so much. Again, please feel free to go to our website, racialequityhunger.org. It was a pleasure being with you. Thank you so much. And I hope that you feel encouraged. Feel encouraged to know that you do have that you can make a difference. Feel encouraged to know that this is hard work, but you are not in it alone. Feel free, again, to use the resources that we provided, very tangible steps that you can do right now, starting today. Have a blessed day. Bye.
Wow, thank you so much, Marlisa and Donald. To everyone at home, my name is Megan Walters, and I work for the World Food Prize Foundation on the Iowa Hunger Summit. What a truly fantastic way to start the 2020 Iowa Hunger Summit. The work of the Racial Equity National Hunger Learning Network is incredibly vital and poignant. My notes are filled with a breakdown of racial equity, systemic racism, the abundant quotes, the principles of promoting racial equity, decolonizing our research, our ideas of experts, all of these great reflections. So thank you truly so much, Marlisa and Donald, for reminding us that intent does not equal impact, and for providing real actionable steps to keep digging into the personal work and institutional work. As we established, we cannot end hunger without ending structural discrimination based on race. We're grateful for the honesty and vulnerability you offered and the moments to breathe. I definitely took advantage of those. And the many resources you provided. As Marlisa mentioned, we will be sharing these resources out in our daily digest, so look for that this afternoon. Again, thank you to the co-chairs of the Racial Equity Hunger National Learning Network, Marlisa Gamblin and Donald Wood, for their exceptional work and dedicated time. Stay tuned for our next panel session, Voice Your Choice.
Now, I would like to introduce our final plenary speakers of today, Michi Lopez and Carter Oswood. Michi is the Access and Equity Coordinator for Iowa Valley RC&D. Michi brings a lens of racial equity to project development and project implementation. She works to identify gaps within current systems, assess entry points for change, and determine ways that partners can more effectively work together for a just food system and elevate voices of Black, Indigenous people of color. Through her work, Michi supports the initiative Grow Johnson County, which addresses the need for fresh produce at more than a dozen hunger relief agencies in Johnson County. Carter Oswood is the executive director and our other speaker today at Feed Iowa First, a grassroots community of businesses, faith organizations, schools, farmers, and volunteers that unite in relationship-based service to help combat food insecurity by growing food and farmers. He believes that equal access to fresh, healthy produce is a basic human right, and is passionate about creating a food system that works for everyone in the community. Today, they'll be talking about Voice Your Choice, which is an iPad-based survey tool developed by the Iowa Valley RC&D that allows agencies to gain valuable food preference information from their clients in a non-intrusive way. Voice Your Choice is currently being used by Iowa Valley's charitable farm program, Grow Johnson County, as well as partner organization Feed Iowa First. Today, Michi and Carter will discuss how this tool was developed, how it works, the benefits and challenges of using it, and how this approach to food assistance works towards community food sovereignty. Welcome, Michi and Carter.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you to the World Food Prize and the Iowa Hunger Summit for allowing us to share about this project. And thank you to Carter for joining me today. And thank you to everyone who is watching this and is interested in learning about Grow Johnson County and the Voice Your Choice project. So a little about myself. My name is Michi, rhymes with Peachy. I am the Access and Equity Coordinator for Iowa Valley Resource Conservation and Development, and I am the Pack Shed and Distribution Manager for Grow Johnson County. I actually started at Iowa Valley through the Grow Johnson County project. I was a volunteer in undergrad, and then I was an apprentice, and now I'm the Pack Shed and Distribution Manager. And so my growth in the organization has really allowed me to see the evolution of the farm project, not only in terms of how the farm physically looks, but also changes to our distribution. So Iowa Valley Resource Conservation and Development is the organization that houses the Grow Johnson County program. We are located in Amana, Iowa, and we work on a variety of projects in East Central Iowa, but also statewide. We have 4 scopes of work, which is community, food, farm, and environment. And the Grow Johnson County project is kind of right at the center of those 4 scopes of work. And I hope that you'll get a better sense of that as I continue to present. But the mission of Iowa Valley Resource Conservation and Development is to enhance the quality of life for Iowans by strengthening food systems, leading collaborative placemaking projects, and bringing technical assistance to rural communities. So Grow Johnson County is a hunger relief and educational farm initiative. We produce close to 40 varieties of fruits and vegetables, and all of the food that we grow is herbicide-free and pesticide-free. So it's organically produced. It is not currently organically certified. Trained staff, apprentices, and volunteers all work together in order to maintain the 5 acres of land that we have out there. They assist in seeding, planting, transplanting, harvesting, cleaning, the whole process. And they help us, we all work together to get food to our 13 partner agencies in Johnson County. And the Grow Johnson County mission is, well, really we believe that food and good food, so not just, chips and soda that, provide calories, but good food is a human right. And so then we made it our mission to combat local food insecurity through charitable food production and then hands-on education projects and opportunities. This is a map of the farm, and just so you can get a better sense of where we do our work. If you were on 218 and trying to head to the University of Iowa, you would get off at the Melrose exit and head east. If you're like me and you're directionally challenged and accidentally head west, you might get a little bit lost and you might end up here at the Johnson County Historic Poor Farm, located here in Iowa City. It is within city limits. The Historic Poor Farm is about 160 acres. I believe 150 of those are on the National Historic Registry, and I won't go too far into details about the story of the Johnson County Historic Poor Farm, but I encourage you to look it up if you're interested. There's several farming projects located on the farm, and Grow Johnson County is one of them. And I have here on this image the 5 acres that we are currently maintaining outlined in red dashes. So Grow Johnson County became a program in 2015. And so people from the community and people who worked at hunger relief agencies noted the need for fresh produce, and not just fresh produce, but organic produce at their sites. It was harder to come by, it's expensive, and really they wanted to be able to provide their clientele with good food. So in 2015, all these people came together and proposed Grow Johnson County to the Johnson County Board of Supervisors, who maintains the Johnson County Historic Poor Farm. And so the Johnson County Board of Supervisors approved of the project, and thus Grow Johnson County was born. So that first year, our lease was signed for 2 acres, and it was all put into cover crop. Soil health is a really big key factor in farming, and so we wanted to make sure that we were being good stewards of the land. And so the first year there was no vegetables or fruits being grown, there was no food being produced. It was all focused on soil health and then identifying who our partners were. And on this image, we have Table to Table, which is an independent food rescue organization also located in Iowa City, Iowa. They are one of our key partners. And so what Table to Table does is they collect edible food from donors, for example, grocery stores, and they distribute that food to hunger relief agencies within Johnson County. Because Table to Table already had that partnership and that delivery route to Johnson County hunger relief agencies, partnering with them, it's amazing. It's an amazing partnership. We get to distribute food to these partner agencies. We're not duplicating any services, and we're providing another source of donated food for Table to Table. So 2016 was our first production year. And in that year, we had 2 acres in production. We had 1 staff member. We had 9 partner agencies in Johnson County, and we distributed 12,000 pounds of produce. When we started, we didn't have all the tools and equipment that we do today. So we were renting equipment, we were using hand tools, pulling weeds by hand, and continuing that outreach and that expansion. And at the time, when we think about like the preferences that our partner agencies wanted, it was so early on that all of their preference was like fresh food. Like, we want good, like fresh local food. And so the crop selection for our farm was based on, the land that we had available, 2 acres, the equipment that we had access to. Again, we were renting equipment. We didn't have equipment stored on farm that was ours. And then also staff experience, what had the staff produce, in their own gardens or in their own farms. In 2017, we see some growth of the program. We increase in the acreage, and then we also increase in the food that we're distributing to, and also the partners that we're distributing to as well. And we are able to purchase our first couple of pieces of equipment. So really, we were increasing our capacity and making a lot of necessary equipment purchases that would expand on our efficiency. And at that time, again, the preference was for fresh produce. Like, we want fresh food. And this was the first year that we had tried to collect. this was our second growing season, but the first year that we had tried to collect some preferences. And so then an online survey was conducted. It was sent out to all of the partnering agencies, but only a few of them participated. And again, the preference was for fresh produce. So in 2018, we had doubled the land that we had started with. We were in 4 acres of production. We moved up to 3 staff members. We have more equipment. We have a hoop house that we had to construct twice because the wind knocked it down the first time. We had launched the organic farm apprenticeship, which I participated in, and we were certified GAP, Good Agricultural Practices. And in that year, was the first year that we collected preferences from all of our partnering agencies. And it was me who did it. And what I did was I went to all the partner agency sites. We just sat down and we talked about, hey, what worked well, what didn't work well. And what do you notice goes quickly? What do you have the space for? Do you have refrigeration? Like, can we send you large bulky items, or would you prefer just a smaller amount of items? Would you prefer a mix or a lot of one produce type? And we got a lot of good feedback, and we were able to use that to help plan out our 2019 growing year. And then in 2019, again, there's more growth, there's more expansion, and there's new partners. There's different partners. There's still this ongoing, like, hey, like, what is working well with your site? What are the cultural preferences? What are the food preferences of people at your site? But in our discussions with our partnering agencies, we kind of noticed that people wanted certain food items, but they didn't want to share what those food items were for fear of seeming ungrateful. And so in 2019, we started thinking, okay, well, how can we get, feedback from the people who are eating our food, not just our partner sites, but like the people who are taking the food home? How can we do this? And how can we respect them and give them space, but also still get all of the necessary information that we need? And so then that was when we developed Voice Your Choice.
Before we go on, we got one question. Alana wants to know where the funds for Grow Johnson County came from.
So we have different funding sources. The county helps fund some of the work that we do, grants. We have a sponsorship program and donations. And I don't have like specifics on the first year where the funds came from, but I can get that for you if you send me an email. All right. So in the first couple of years, before I get into the Voice Your Choice survey, in the first couple of years, we would harvest food in the mornings, and table to table would come around noon, and then we would send all of our food out. And agencies along the route that day got to pick, what they wanted from the available produce items. And this worked well because agencies got a variety of choices, and they got to pick what they wanted and leave what they didn't want. But this also didn't work well because if you were one of the later agencies on the route, you were kind of stuck with whatever was left over. Actually, one of our apprentices in 2018 was a table-to-table route driver. And by the time he got to the last site on a day, all that was available was turnips. And the site was a meal prep site. And the person said, well, I can't take any of these turnips. I can't use any of these turnips. Like, it doesn't work for our site. And I feed a lot of children. Like, it doesn't work. It doesn't go into a smoothie. It's not an easy afternoon like snack. So we can't take it. And also in that year, in 2018, to another site, I had distributed a large quantity of Napa cabbage, thinking that like, oh, this is a large site. People like Napa cabbage. They're going to like all this Napa cabbage. And the site actually reported back to me that, almost no one took any of the Napa cabbage, so they ended up having to compost a lot of the Napa cabbage. And so then after that, we decided to stop growing Napa cabbage because I had reached out to other agencies and they shared the same sentiment that the Napa cabbage was just not popular. So at that point in time, any changes to our distribution and our production was just made through like casual feedback. And voice your choice really is how Grow Johnson County practices food sovereignty. So food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food systems. So to sum it all up, food sovereignty is about connecting people and the land, but also the producers, the farmers, and the people who eat the food. You know, everyone is an eater. Everyone goes to the store if you're able to and gets the things that you want. So you should have a say in not only how your food is being produced, but what foods are being produced for you. Thinking back to like the turnips and the Napa cabbage incident, like we don't want to give people food that they're not going to enjoy, that they can't use, not only from a waste perspective, but also just from a human connections perspective. Food should be enjoyable. Food should be good. And if you don't think a food is good, why would we try and force feed that to you? So thus, Voice Your Choice was born. So Voice Your Choice is a survey, and it is hosted on an iPad stand. It is an online survey, so Wi-Fi connection is needed. The survey is a link, and we did this in this way because if we use Wi-Fi, if we use a survey in an online link, we're able to download all of the responses. We're able to download the information about what time it was taken, and then also like the general area and where it was taken in. So if it was taken at a certain site, we were able to say, oh, all of these responses came from one site. All of these responses came from, site 2. All of these responses came from site 3, so on and so forth. We worked with a Running Robots, which is an Iowa City website design and tech company, to develop the survey and the webpage. The cost breakdown cost $5,000 to create Voice Your Choice. We received funds from the City of Iowa City Climate Action Grant to create and pilot the Voice Your Choice software. And in the leftmost picture, you can see me with an iPad, and it's located in an iPad stand. So that way we can just place the stand at our partner agency sites, and the people can just walk up. Pre-COVID, people could just walk up in the agency and go ahead and start taking the survey. We piloted this in January of 2020. So we piloted it for 4 weeks at 5 partnering sites, and we received 165 responses in 5 different languages. So this is the landing page. Right when you walk up to the survey, this is what you see. The lighting's a little off, but it says start the survey. And the background is actually an animated video. And we did this because, just having an iPad out might not be super attractive, but if people see like all these little dancing vegetables, they might look over there and be like, huh, I wonder what that is. This is the first thing that happens after you click start the survey. You're taken to the language selection page, and we launched this pilot in these 7 languages. As I mentioned earlier, 5 of them were used to create the survey or respond to the survey. The second page of Voice Your Choice is the actual survey. So the language selection was for the very limited text that we have. We really wanted this survey to be accessible, and so it is mostly image based. If you look here at this screenshot of the survey, there's largely they're centralized on the image of the food, and then there's also the text, the name of the food that's underneath. And so then the text here is in English, and if you selected Spanish, it would be in Spanish. Again, we just wanted, accessibility wise, you just want to see it. You want to see what the food item is, and the instructions, I think it got cut off here in the screenshot, just said, pick what foods you like. And so being on an iPad, which is touchscreen, people are able to click on and select which items that they wanted to see more of, that they wanted to eat, that they thought was good food.
And then we got one question from Andrea. She asks, you said that communities are able to choose the food in order to create their own food systems. How are they able to know which of these foods they need in order to have a nutritious and complete alimentation?
Yeah, I think this is really, I'm trying to think about the best way to tactfully answer this. So everyone has different food cultures. If you think about the ABCs, when you're teaching, you're singing to children, you'll say A is for apple. A is not always for apple. So we tend to think of like apples as being, okay, good, nutritious choice, just because of that food culture that we were taught of. And so everyone's view and preferences on what is healthy and nutritious is quite different. And so we provided, this is only one section of the survey. The survey had more options, for example, like okra and some other herbs as well. And so people are able to select really anything. What we have on the survey was items that we know grow well in Iowa, that we have grown, and that foods that have been mentioned to us by a couple of people as to what they think we should grow, and people were able to select from there. All right, so the results. This slide shows the language preferences. Again, this was this was piloted at 5 sites, and you can see the breakdown of languages per site. We had 3 of the sites, you only had the need for the surveys in English, and then 2 of the other sites required used the other languages as well. I believe Chinese and Arabic were the 2 languages that were not used. These are the top 10 choices per site. And you can see that not all of them are exactly the same. That's okay. We actually love the fact that they're different, because as the distribution manager, I try to cater the distribution to the site as well as I can. So knowing that people at, site 1 prefer, getting large slicer tomatoes versus onions, whereas another site prefers onions, I'm able to allocate more tomatoes to site 1 versus more onions to site 3. And the top 10 items that people requested were onions, watermelons, carrots, potatoes, broccoli, bell pepper, garlic, cherry tomatoes, Roma tomatoes, and slicer tomatoes. So tomatoes, a lot of tomatoes, a lot more onions, and watermelon was actually tied for number 1, which we found to be really surprising. We thought that it would be onions and potatoes. We didn't expect watermelon and carrots to beat out the potatoes. And this is what we did with the results. So this is an aerial of the Grow Johnson County farm. And because so many people requested watermelons. Over here to the left, you can see we dedicated a whole field. I think this is about quarter acre, third of an acre to melons alone. We dedicated twice that to potatoes and close to that in onions as well. And then we also grew cauliflower for the first time because it was such a highly requested item as well. And then we increased our carrot yield. We increased a lot. So we took all of the information that we had gotten from our partners, and then we compared that to the data that we had gotten from the Voice Your Choice survey, and we really used it to inform our planting plan for 2020. So adaptability, how can something like Voice Your Choice be adapted to your site? And is this survey available for use? So the survey is available for use, and that is why Carter is here presenting with us from Feed Iowa First. He's going to talk a little bit about how they used the Voice Your Choice survey and how they adapted it. So I will turn it over to Carter, who is the executive director for Feed Iowa First.
Thanks, Michi. Hey, everybody. I'll talk very briefly about our 3 programs. Feed Iowa First, we have Grow Some Rows, where we encourage people throughout the community in Cedar Rapids, Greater Lynn County, to allocate a portion of their home garden to grow produce that will come back to Feed Iowa First. We have Don't Waste, Donate, which is this, it's a program that has outreach to rural farmers, where we kind of provide them an outlet to donate any food that may not be economically viable to sell, if it's not pretty enough, too big, too small. This also encompasses our gleaning branch, where we'll come out and recover any food that may be tilled in, again, that may not be economically viable to pick or to harvest. And then we have our final program, which is Grow, Don't Mow. So Grow, Don't Mow, we utilize land that would be otherwise underutilized. We provide services to till this land and provide plant starts. So we have, as of 2020, 26 partnerships for urban farms around Cedar Rapids. These are, they're on historic sites at Bruce Moore, National Czech and Slovak. They are as small as 20 feet in diameter and as large as 40, 100-foot rows out at Rockwell Collins. And then the way this works is that the congregation at the churches or employees at the businesses, they help to maintain these urban farms, watering, weeding, aesthetically pleasing, and harvesting all this produce. So out of those 3 programs, all the food that's generated and aggregated is chemical free. All intents and purposes, it's organic, just not certified. All that produce comes back to our shop, where it is cleaned and stored, and then it goes out for distribution. So our model of distribution, we have a converted 15-seater van, where we take all the produce and we go 50% direct to food pantries and setup, and then 50% into communities that are facing no food insecurity. So our distribution model looks quite a bit different than Table to Table and Grow Johnson County's partnership, in that we go and set up, it's kind of like a makeshift farmer's market, except it's consistent at the spots every week. And we set up the bins of food and have all the PPE, plexiglass, etc., and people line up. And it's fairly well known. When we pull in, people are usually always waiting. At some points, it may be, the only access for fresh produce, either due to transportation or cost barrier. So when you walk through the line, we have a bag, and individuals can point and select however much of the produce they want. There's really no cap, and there's no, they can come as many times as they want every week. And so what we were finding is that our information came largely from what was gone at the end of each distribution. So was it kale? Was it collards that went quicker? Hot pepper, sweet pepper? So a lot of this was a little bit unreliable for seed purchasing and for planning out for the 26 urban farms. And so we got in touch with Iowa Valley, and they kind of talked to us about this Voice Your Choice survey. And the neat thing is that our model, since it is so different, it doesn't go to a partner organization. It actually comes on the bus with us, the veggie van, out to distribution, where people can perform the survey, and it's 2 simple questions, just language and then type of produce that they like. And our findings were fairly similar. We were only able to pilot this for about 2 weeks, and then the derecho hit. So that kind of changed our distribution. It was kind of go, go, go. We just started it up again last week, and similar results. Our 2 top items were watermelon and corn. And we're excited to kind of continue this just to inform our seed purchasing, because it's, in this model, we're moving very much from a push to a pull, understanding, what the preference is in the community, and if it's different at different locations and quadrants of the city. The nice thing that we're finding with the survey is that it can timestamp it as well. So we know where the survey was taken at what time, and we can kind of cross-reference that with our point of distribution. So we're really excited about the data that we were able to get this year, and we're even more excited about what we're going to be able to get next year.
Yeah, so in terms of adaptability, the survey is not Grow Johnson County specific. Feed Iowa First, as Carter was saying, has a completely different distribution model, and they were able to adapt it and use it as well. And this model can also be applied to other hunger relief sites. So you could have, milk or eggs or meats, cheeses, instead of just, vegetables as well, to help you as a site get a better understanding of what it is that your clientele wants, especially if you're also having maybe those offhanded discussions with someone about what else would you like to see? And they're like, oh, no, like what you have is what we're grateful for. But then, maybe you overhear someone in line saying like, dang, I really wish they had cantaloupe or, etc. So we're able to use Voice Your Choice to kind of overcome that barrier of getting information from people without making them feel like they're being ungrateful.
And one thing to that point too that we found is it really is a bit of a conversation starter too on that task. So because of using this, we kind of found that white eggplant in one community was hugely sought after. And I don't know if we would have uncovered that information, may or may not have, but with this kind of generating the talk about food, and what do you like and what would you like to see? It might not be on there. They're just more open to speaking, is what we found.
Yeah, exactly. It might not be on there, which is also some feedback that we got from some of our partner sites as well. Which leads us to what we learn and what we still don't know. As we both kind of mentioned, there might be stuff that's not currently on the survey that people want to see grown. And so with this pilot, because it happened pre-COVID, I was able to go to some of the sites and talk to people if they had wanted to talk about the survey. And so I was able to take notes on, what other items that we could potentially add to the survey. Because I am also a member of the production team, I know what we're able to grow, or what would be available within the next growing season. So if someone asked us, oh, well, you should grow apples, I would be like, okay, like you definitely want more fruit options. I'm not going to be able to get you apples next year. We don't have any apple trees out at the farm, but I can take that information and share it with the partner site and be like, hey, like a lot of people actually really want more fruit options. And so we know what people want from what we've offered them. What we still don't know is what other options there are for all of our partner sites. And also, COVID hit, and then the derecho hit. And so then we, like, again, this was just a pilot. We'll have to do it again just to see how people's preferences have changed. Maybe they don't want, something that'll go bad really quick. Like, not really quick, but like kales or greens, because it has to be refrigerated. But maybe they prefer to have, even more potatoes because they don't have to be refrigerated and they can sit out for longer. And I don't know if, Carter, you have anything to add to the what we learned and what we still don't know. I know your survey collection was interrupted.
Yeah, it was, and it was a bit unfortunate. We've tried other ways to kind of aggregate data, but there's never been something with hard format. It's been, like, for example, right after the derecho, or about, the same week, we harvested our potato crop, and I know I drove 1,800 pounds worth of potatoes in my truck bed to one of the sites, and it was gone within 15 minutes, which was pretty telling about what is wanted. And there are some staple crops that we know, just based on what goes quick: onions, potatoes, things that can store. And people, what we found is cross-culturally, there are items that are popular. And so kind of some of that speaks for itself, but especially, when we go to look at potatoes, we know to increase because we're almost out. We thought that would be lasting all the way through the winter. We do have 2 questions, Michi. How much to license the software? The question's coming from Larisse.
Yeah, why don't you send me an email and we can talk about that.
And then there's one other. Is there a fee to use the survey in other parts of Iowa? That's from Barbara.
Yeah, why don't you also send me an email and we can talk about that as well.
Perfect.
All right, and so then before we sign off, I just wanted to take a minute and recognize some of the sponsors for Grow Johnson County who have helped make our work possible. Again, we started, our first production year was in 2016 and now we're in 2020. So we've got 5 years almost 5 years under our belt. We're still harvesting and distributing. Actually, I was at the farm just before I hopped onto this call, and they help make this good work possible. And then also to our partners as well, who take all of the food and who distribute all of the food as well, because without them, we wouldn't be able to get to the food to where it needs to go.
And we have a question from Jessica. Do you think watermelon was a popular pick because it is one of the few fruits shown? Are fruits the least available of all the fresh food?
I will say that we do have more vegetable options. We do have a couple of fruit options. The one at the top of the other option at the top of my head that we thought might be popular was cantaloupe, but it wasn't as popular as, or muskmelon. Muskmelon wasn't as popular as we thought it would be. And so then the comparison between the two changed drastically, like was very noticeable. But that is a great question. I don't know, if we had more fruit options on there, would it be more popular?
Thank you, Michi and Carter. It was a delight to have both of you with us today. As a reminder to all, please be on the lookout for our daily digest later. We'll be sure to include resources referenced during the plenary session here. And if it's all right with you, Michi, we'll be able to share your contact information as well, so you can reconnect with a few of our attendees. Now, before we take a break, before our afternoon breakouts, I want to provide a reminder for those of you who have registered and received confirmation emails for the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation. Please connect via the unique Zoom login link you have received. Unfortunately, we were not able to fit everyone into the simulation, so we'll be sure to include further resources and materials from our organizers in our afternoon daily digest, which will go out following the afternoon breakout sessions. As a reminder, you will connect with our breakout sessions at 2 p.m. via www.iowahungersummit.org/live. So the page that you were directed to earlier today to watch our plenary sessions. There on that page, you'll be able to decide which sessions you would like to attend and directly connect to the session via that page. Thank you, and I hope to see you later.